Hi, welcome to our next to last presentation in the Sustainable Solutions Seminar Series, co-sponsored by the School of the Environment, Institute for Sustainable Solutions, and the Department of Architecture. We are happy to have today Dr. Alan Yeakley, Professor of Environmental Studies at Portland State, and a panel of students who are going to be presenting work on an IGERT grant that they have had looking at the complex problems of urbanizing delta regions, and they've spent some time in Netherlands working with a group of scholars, European scholars, on trying to address some of these issues. So I'm going to like to present Alan Yeakley, and he will present to you the panel of students. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. So this is going to be a little bit of a difference from maybe a traditional seminar. I'm not going to present a study and some results and give you the findings. This is more of an ongoing collaborative process, and you're going to see maybe right in the middle of the sausage being made about how we're trying to think about this in a collaborative way with 5 different countries, students from 5 different countries, thinking about a common problem, but looking at it from different disciplinary ways and trying to come together around a framework which can then address what we call wicked problems, and they will describe this in more detail, existing in and around delta regions. And so my big job is just to introduce the students, because this is really a student-run project, and so they have the spotlight. So I'd just like to mention all of their backgrounds and tell you a little bit about them, and then I'll hand it over to them. In no particular order, Basma Mohammed is going to be presenting part of it, and she's coming to us from Duke University, a master's there, and I can't remember the undergrad. Tufts University, so East Coast. And then we have Marissa Matzler, who comes to us from Oregon State and Yale University. She's starting this past year, along with Basma, in the IGERT program. And then we have Sarah Holman, who also from Oregon State University and then from Portland State, and is another IGERT trainee who just started this past fall. And then we have Jody Schoonen, who comes to us from lots of places, right? University of Washington and Cornell, yes. And she's also an IGERT trainee. And finally, Kelly Cowan, who is in the engineering technology management. He's a doctoral candidate in that program, and he has a master's in undergrad from the University of New Mexico. So you can see quite a diverse array of expertise coming to bear. And then if you put these 5 together with students from Germany, from Sweden, from Indonesia, and the Netherlands, you've got quite a mixture of expertises and backgrounds that are trying to approach this framework. So I would like to then turn it over to them to present. So, Marissa Matzler.
Thanks. Just to give you guys a little taste of the rest of the group that we have here. So there's 4 different teams that we are actually coordinating with at the moment. Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands is actually heading up this whole project that we'll be describing to you here. So we really have a lot of different groups that we're coordinating with, a lot of early/late meetings working with the time change and that kind of thing. So it's been a really fun process. So just to give you a taste of the Netherlands here. We're also working with a client. We've been working with the Delta Alliance, which is an international network that is interested in delta regions. And they're interested in deltas for a variety of reasons. They're very highly productive areas, very unique ecosystems are present there, and they also provide a variety of services for humans, both economic, ecological, and social. So what exactly is River Delta? Just to get everybody on the same page, here's some satellite images of a few different river deltas. A river delta forms when we have a river that meets a slower moving body of water. So for example, a lake or a reservoir, or in the case of the deltas that we're looking at, the ocean. So you can see if I can get my pointer working here. Aha. So here's some beautiful delta regions from the Netherlands. This is Zeeland in the Netherlands. And you can see as the water is flowing down through the river, it's picking up everything around it. A lot of sediments and nutrients are flowing with the water down to the ocean, and when it gets there, it slows down, and therefore it doesn't have enough energy to keep moving that sediment. So you have these beautiful plumes of sediment right here that over time form delta regions. And so that is the focus of our study here. That's the ecosystem focus of our study. Sorry, I'll get myself situated. So one iconic river delta that you guys might be familiar with is the Nile River Delta. And you can see down here it has this very classic V shape. And this is a really wonderful example of how deltas have provided services such as fertile soil, biodiversity, connectivity, all sorts of ecosystem services for thousands and thousands of years. So we've had successful settlements in delta regions for quite some time, and they continue to develop. So there are really large urban centers that are now centered on river deltas. Now they're urban river deltas. So while these deltas, living in these deltas really provides some amazing opportunities, there are also a lot of ecological trade-offs that come into play when you're living in a delta region. For example, seasonal flooding becomes very important, and as we'll discuss a little bit later, waterborne disease also becomes an issue in these regions. Also, when you start to think about all of the water that's flowing off of the entire watershed ends up there in that delta region. So you end up with a concentration of pollutants from all of the activities throughout that region. So there's really a complicated system of trade-offs that you have to look at when you begin to discuss these places. And these trade-offs result in a variety of wicked problems. So a wicked problem is really something that is a problem that is associated with a complex system. And these complex systems have a myriad of complicated feedback loops. And really what this means is that any solution to any one problem in these regions can lead to a variety of new issues and problems. So for us working in these regions, it really means that there's no one right answer to sustainable development in a delta. It's really just this series of trade-offs. So that's really the entry point for our group here. The team really recognized, and the group at Radboud University, Radboud Honours Academy, I apologize, really recognized this need to deal with trade-offs, and so has assembled this team to focus in on some of these important issues. So our client, Delta Alliance, tasked our group with assembling an integrated approach to sustainable urban delta development. Now, this presentation, as Dr. Yeakley mentioned, is really going to highlight the steps of the process. We're right in the middle of this right now, so we're really going to talk to you about the process that we're currently going through. I'm just going to begin with a brief overview of the steps, and then my colleagues will dig in a little more. So really what we're looking at is review, integration, and application. So we began our review with our trip to the Netherlands. All of the teams convened there to really observe case studies from around the country and see how the Netherlands is dealing with some of the wicked problems in their own deltas. When we returned to our home countries, we began to review various sustainability frameworks. There are a lot of tools that are out there right now that could be helpful in delta-specific approaches, and so we didn't need to reinvent the wheel here. So we really started to draw on the experience of our home institutions. And we're currently involved in this second step, the integration step, where we are assembling these framework ideas and case studies into a document that is really describing an integrated approach for this sustainable development. That will lead us into our third and final step. In April of this year, we will be reconvening all together in person here at Portland State University. So all of the teams that we introduced at the beginning will be traveling here to go through a series of workshops to really complete that integration step, really complete our document and get a solid approach to then apply to a very specific case in Indonesia. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that at the end. But first, to kind of dig into this review step a little more, Jody and Basma are going to share some of the lessons learned straight from the Netherlands.
Thanks, Marissa. So, as Marissa discussed, we started with review when we were in the Netherlands. We're now in integration, and we're moving forward to application in April. So I'm going to take us back to the review part, which is basically when we flew over to the Netherlands, spent a lot of time discussing, and then hopped on a few buses over a course of a few days and went and toured various projects. So the Netherlands is a country built on the idea of keeping the water out. So it's a huge focus. Part of the land is below seawater. Part of it is about a meter above seawater. So there's a huge emphasis on building dikes and other structures to keep the water out. A few factors that are causing a cultural shift or a kind of a worldview shift are climate change and sea level rise and sinking land. And there's a process of building up higher dikes, but people are realizing that that's not a great solution because if the dike breaches, it's a huge risk for people living there. So a national project that's happening right now, it's being implemented at present, is called Room for the River. And it's essentially a river widening project that's going on at a national level. And it's an example of a collective countrywide path forward with a lot of stakeholder involvement. And when we were there, we were able to go visit at least, we visited 2 different sites along the Room for the River. And I'll talk about the first one, which is Overdiep Sepolder, and then Basma will talk about the Millingerwald afterwards. So here's an overview map of the Room for the River project plan. You can see it's enormous. It basically started with 700 potential sites that were put on the table, and 39 were selected, and then 35 were taken forward for implementation. They run along the gradient from being completely urban to agricultural to restoration-based, and they run along the entire river delta up into the watershed. The implementation period has been from between 2009, it'll go to 2015, and the money for the project has been committed up front, which means it's not subject to annual appropriations, and that ultimately ends up saving the country a lot of money. The entire budget for the project is 2.3 billion euros, which equates to about $3 billion US. And the project Overdiep Sepolder is right here, kind of in the lower area that I'll talk about. We had heard a little bit about this project before we actually got there on the bus, and it didn't sound that extreme, and then you show up and you realize it's pretty extreme and pretty interesting. So basically it's a grassroots effort of a bunch of dairy farmers to respond to a government plan for Room for the River. So the government plan was that they wanted to move a dike. So the farmers are located right here. The plan was to move this dike back, which would increase flooding in this farmland. So this area is called a polder, and it's basically an area of low-lying land that's been reclaimed from a body of water by dikes. So if they were to move the dike back, these farmers would get flooded, and that's not a great solution, obviously. So about 18 of them got together, and they came up with a plan and brought it forth to the government agencies and said, okay, you can do it, but here's what we request. And what they requested was that these mounds be built, right here, and that they could set their farms on top of the mounds, and then when the river, when there were high flow events and the river flooded, their property would be protected above the water level. And then when the other, 90% of the time, when it's not flooded, they could use that land for their animals. About 9 of the 18 decided to take this option, and about 9 decided to move their farms to other locations within the country. Here's a plan view of the same process, and you can see here the little mounds that they're on, the farms are built on, and this image is showing a high flow event when the water's coming in. And then here is an example mound with the animals down in the agricultural area and the house protected up on an area. Here's another view, kind of an artist rendering. On the left is when there isn't a high flow event, and then on the right is when a picture of what it would look like in a high flow event. So the reason we wanted to show this was because it's a great example of the power that stakeholders have in contributing to a public process and discovering these sustainable solutions to some wicked problems. So we got to meet with the farmers. It was just a great day. It was really interesting and inspiring to hear their stories. So again, over Deep Sepulder right here. Moving on up the watershed, Basma's going to talk a little bit about another project that has a lot of similarities and also a lot of differences.
Just going to get situated here too. So I'm going to talk to you about, so Nijmegen is here. Over Deep Sepulder was on the other side of the city. And on one of our days, we drove east of Nijmegen to this area, which is zoomed in over here, which is now a nature reserve. So they removed a dike along the River Val and just sort of allowed a few hundred hectares to flood and to sort of return it to the floodplain of the Val. And it's called Millinger Ward, and essentially it's a created area of green space not that far from the city, and the community is right next to the nature preserve, which is this community here, Millinger, and then this community down here, Kirkendam. They actually have a tourism boom now occurring in these small towns. So restaurants have opened up to cater to people who come to visit the nature preserve. So it was an interesting case study. And then when we were actually touring the reserve, it's not necessarily managed for invasive species, so the understory is just kind of going through succession, and all of the tall plants right here are invasive impatient species to the Netherlands, or non-native species. But then that means that the reserve is a place of high biodiversity, which is sort of an ecosystem service provision for this part of the Netherlands, which is largely surrounded by old industrial and agricultural lands in these smaller towns. So here, this is a brick factory that is actually destined to become decommissioned right next to the reserve as part of the river widening project. And the River Val is right adjacent to the nature preserve, so people have a view of the water and can walk right along it, and also see all the ships go further up the Val to Germany. So this is just to reorient you to that, and you can actually on Google Maps even see all the ship traffic. So this was just an interesting area to visit because there aren't that many national parks in the Netherlands. So there are about 20 total national parks, but this is a smaller nature preserve that is providing a lot of cultural and community services, if you will, to Nijmegen and the surrounding towns. And so now I'm going to turn this over to Kelly, who will talk to you a little bit more about that integration step that we are proceeding forward with the students abroad.
All right, so thanks, Basma. So like Basma said, for the next stage in this project, we had to look at how do we integrate this whole process together. How do we take what we've learned and move forward? And for dealing with the kinds of projects that they've presented, some of the sustainable development projects, and for addressing some of the wicked problems that have been kind of alluded to, it's often common to look at different frameworks, sustainable development frameworks for making decisions. And now I realize that a lot of folks who come to sustainability seminars are probably familiar with some of these frameworks, but I was going to spend just a little bit of time going through these. And for the purposes of this project, we really had to relate them specifically to some of the wicked problems being handled in urban river deltas. So I'm going to try to address it on that level. So let's see. Probably the most common definition that you hear for sustainable development is the Brundtland definition from 1987. Folks are probably familiar with that: development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is obviously a good definition, but one issue is that when you're dealing with urban river deltas, this definition is a bit heavy in its orientation toward resource development, whereas in deltas we're looking at a lot of issues related to ecosystems, and we just need to add some additional considerations for the resilience and integrity of living systems, for the special role that these places play, some of the social sustainability measures like equity and well-being of local people. So we're just trying, as we're thinking about all these lessons learned and how do we proceed forward, how can we define these things in ways that really address all the key needs that are important that we've learned about in these regions. And generally, like I say, a framework is used to analyze this. Frameworks consist of tools, methods, models, ways of trying to evaluate development impacts and different project outcomes. So frameworks also tend to evaluate factors along a number of dimensions, including economic, social, environmental, and cultural dimensions. So here are some examples of some common frameworks for sustainable development that have been created over the past 50 years. We show about 30 of the more common ones up here. And there are many different ways you can categorize them. In this case, on the X and Y axis, we've got integrated and selective and visionary and actionable. The colored circles also represent some of those dimensions of sustainability that I was mentioning: the environmental, social, economic, cultural. But the key point that I'm trying to make, just throwing up a bunch of these frameworks here, is that there are a lot of these that are good for very specific types of problems that you're going to try to solve. But for any one problem that you're looking at, there's probably no one framework that's just going to be the right answer for solving those problems, because this depends greatly on the types of values that you're trying to emphasize, the kind of outcome that you're trying to achieve. So what we're looking at here is how do you look at the most appropriate frameworks or combinations of elements from different frameworks that can be put together for solving the types of wicked problems that we've mentioned in urban river deltas. And we focused primarily on this upper right-hand quadrant of frameworks that were considered integrated and actionable. But even in that quadrant, there's quite a bit of variation. So if you look at some of the frameworks like the living principles of design and the Presidio model, these are primarily frameworks that deal with issues related to product design. And obviously, that's just one type of challenge that you might face in some of the projects. Other frameworks involve things that emphasize specific dimensions of sustainability, and some frameworks deal with, they try to deal with a whole range of issues. They try to be kind of all-inclusive. But our goal here is really to see, which of these plus elements of others might be useful for solving these types of problems that we've been seeing. And if you look at the arrow here, we focused in on two categories, two main types of frameworks that seemed highly relevant in the situation. We looked at natural capitalism and the natural step. And in fact, because we were trying to deal with issues like biodiversity, human settlement, kinds of economic activity that occurs in deltas, and the sensitivity to the impact of those activities, we drilled further down into some of those frameworks, and we looked at, for instance, in the case of natural capitalism, closely related concepts in ecosystem services, and in the case of natural step, the flexible framework for strategic sustainable development. So our team members also had strong skill sets in these areas, and the next phase of this process involves taking a look at this. And now to tell you just a little bit more about these frameworks and how we're putting this all together, I'm going to turn things over to Sarah.
Thank you, Kelly. So as Kelly mentioned, we're really focusing in on two of the main sustainable development approaches, and one of those being the natural step. Now, the natural step, within the natural step, there's this strategic framework for sustainable development. And this is really guided by the natural steps four principles of sustainability. You can see these principles of sustainability summarized on the slide. I actually stole this right from the Natural Step website, if you're wondering where that came from. And these really emphasize reducing the actions that will put pollutants into our biosphere, both man-made and natural pollutants, as well as reducing the amount of physical degradation we do to our surrounding ecosystems. And in addition, they really emphasize avoiding actions that will have high social costs or undermine a society's capacity to be resilient in the face of change. So again, these are kind of very broad general principles of sustainability that this framework really focuses on through the process. And it has a very well-developed process. Again, that's known as FSSD, also the Framework for Strategic Sustainable Development. I'm really focusing in on that. Now, to complement this really well-developed sustainable planning process, we have brought in this concept of ecosystem services. Now, I'm sure this audience is very familiar with the concept of ecosystem services as laid out in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, also discussed by Costanza, Daly, and others. And this really provides a holistic language as well as structure for approaching these sustainable problems and solutions. So as we talked about a little earlier, these wicked problems in the urban river deltas are really multidimensional. And so to try to find solutions and be innovative, you need to have a multi-dimensional approach to really evaluate the social, the cultural, the ecological, and the economic trade-offs, thresholds, and impacts that these decisions may have. So we are really in the conceptual phase of integrating these two ideas along with some other approaches that we've reviewed. And we're really focusing in on the well-developed process of the natural step, that strategic framework for sustainable development, and this structure and multidimensional language that ecosystem services provides. We're really hoping that by integrating these two concepts, we can broach some of these wicked problems and in these urbanizing delta regions. Like Marissa mentioned earlier, these wicked problems are multidimensional, and so if you have a narrow focus, you may not fully comprehend the total number of trade-offs or impacts your decision will have. And so to innovate sustainable solutions in these areas, we really need to have this holistic approach and a robust process. So as I said, this is really in a conceptual phase right now, and we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of this integration and creating this approach in the spring school, and Marissa's going to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so this is really leading us into our final step here, the home stretch, which is the application of our approach to a very specific case study. So wicked problems are very context specific. And our client is an international organization, as I said before, that's really looking for a tool that's going to be able to address wicked problems around the world. So while we are very Delta specific, we are also looking to create this generic framework that can be used in a lot of different contexts. And so Indonesia will be our case study, our application site, which we will address in the spring school. Indonesia comes with its own specific set of wicked problems. Specifically here are a lot of public health issues. They have quite a few disease epidemics that are very related to water. Dengue fever, which is transmitted via mosquitoes, is of urgent concern in many areas. And these are just devastating epidemics that need to be dealt with immediately. And so really using the approach in this kind of setting really tests the bounds of what it can do. And so we feel that a comprehensive approach is really going to be critical when you start to look at some of these things. As Sarah was mentioning, this narrow approach can really lead to a lot of negative effects further down the road. For example, dealing with mosquito populations, one very popular method to do this is to begin draining a lot of your wetlands and your marshlands. But now we know that this can have a lot of negative ecological effects that really impact human well-being further down the line. So we're working to provide this integrated and holistic view that can really give a clearer definition of all the trade-offs on the front end. So as you're approaching these problems and looking at the solutions, you can really have a more robust idea of what you're getting into. So we're really looking forward to digging into this further in April. As I say, we're still working on this, and probably right now on the other side of the world, someone is busily working on our document. I know it. So it's been very fun to coordinate around the world and really get this multicultural perspective, and also learn about how to deal with the time change, deal with communicating with all these different group members. And I really think that it's going to pay off big in the end. So we'd just like to thank all the people that helped us out here, especially Radboud Honours Academy hosting us in the Netherlands, really showing us a lot of great techniques. So thank you for your time. If you have any questions. Oh, that's a great. Oh, yeah. Sorry. So, well, I could repeat the question. She was curious why we chose the specific delta, or the delta that you just saw before in Indonesia, for our specific case. That was very client-driven. So the Delta Alliance there are a few partners that they are working with. And they're very interested in this case in Indonesia. And there is a team from a university there which will be very, critical to us working on the problems there. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, 2 universities in Indonesia. Thank you.
And as we were there, of course, they explained a lot of background as well. So Indonesia is a former Dutch colony, and there's a lot of interest in what's going on over there. So they seem to have connections with the universities. And it was also interesting to make sure that the lessons learned would be something that you could transfer from, a country like the Netherlands to a country like Indonesia. So, we could come up with lots of solutions, but if they were, for want of a better word, a Cadillac solution, it might work in the Netherlands but not work in Indonesia. So that was part of the reason that I think they were really interested in seeing what could be done there.
Any other questions?
I'm wondering if you could explain your client, the Delta Alliance. Can you explain their structure, their purpose, who's involved, how they're funded, what their goals are?
Yeah, definitely. Is anybody? Yeah, I can definitely. They are a network. They are a network organization, is how they refer to themselves, and it is a nonprofit. So they are formed together in a nonprofit structure, and they're paired with various businesses as well as universities. So they are really a group that is attempting to put people together and to integrate the knowledge of a lot of different organizations. So it is not just in one spot in the world, and they are definitely international, really bringing together a lot of different players. I'm trying to think of the funding scheme at the moment, and I'm not sure exactly all of the funding that they're receiving, but I know as a nonprofit they're receiving a fair amount of grant money and these sorts of things. But yes, they do. They have a wonderful website if you look them up. Very beautiful Delta pictures as well, and really interesting descriptions of what they're doing.